The blast of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, silencing the usual afternoon commotion as Josephine Valdez ducked behind an overturned water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was 1878, and the West was still wild, untamed, and unforgiving, especially for a woman determined to make it on her own. She hadn't expected trouble when she'd arrived in town just days ago, but trouble had found her regardless, in the form of 3 drunken ranch hands who had taken offense to her refusal of their advances. "Come on out, pretty lady," one of them drawled, the slur in his voice promising nothing good. "We just want to be friendly-like." Josephine pressed her back against the rough wood of the trough, mentally calculating the distance to her rented room above the general store. Too far. She'd never make it without being seen. Her fingers curled around the small derringer in her pocket, her father's parting gift before she'd left San Antonio. 2 shots. She had 2 shots against their 3 revolvers. "I believe the lady made her wishes clear." A deep voice cut through the tense silence, steady and dangerous as a rattlesnake's warning. "And in my experience, gentlemen respect a lady's wishes." Josephine peered around the edge of the trough to see a tall figure standing in the middle of the street. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, chaps covered in trail dust, and a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His stance was casual, but the hand hovering near the holster on his hip was anything but. "This ain't your concern, stranger," the tallest of the 3 men spat, turning to face the newcomer. "When you start shooting up a town I'm passing through, you make it my concern." The stranger's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. "Now, I suggest you boys move along before things get complicated." The 3 men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reassessing their odds. The stranger hadn't drawn his weapon, but something in his posture, a coiled readiness, made it clear he wouldn't hesitate if pushed. "Ain't worth it," muttered the one who'd spoken first. "Let's go." Josephine watched as they retreated, stumbling slightly in their haste to disappear down a side street. Only when they were gone did she stand, brushing dust from her skirts with trembling hands. The stranger turned toward her, and Josephine caught her breath. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking in a way that made it difficult to look away. "Thank you," she said, finding her voice at last. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Nothing good," he replied, his gaze scanning the street before returning to her face. "You all right, madam?" "Yes, thanks to you." She extended her hand. "Josephine Valdez, I'm new to Redemption Creek." He hesitated for a moment before accepting her hand, his touch brief but surprisingly gentle for a man whose calloused palm spoke of hard work and harder living. "Garrett Mason, just passing through." "Well, Mr. Mason, I'm grateful for your intervention. May I buy you a meal at the hotel restaurant? It seems the least I can do." Something flickered in his eyes, wariness perhaps, or reluctance. "Not necessary, Miss Valdez. Just did what any decent man would do." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Mr. Mason," she called after him, surprising herself with her boldness. "Those men might come back. I'd feel safer with some company, at least until nightfall." He paused, shoulders stiff beneath his worn shirt. For a moment, Josephine thought he would refuse again, but then he turned back, expression unreadable. "One meal," he said finally. "But don't go getting any ideas. This ain't about anything more than a hot meal and making sure those fools don't circle back around." Josephine nodded, relieved. "Of course. I understand completely." But as they walked toward the hotel, she noticed how his hand hovered near her elbow without quite touching it, guiding her around muddy patches in the street and stepping slightly ahead when they passed dark alleyways. His words said one thing, but his hands, those careful, protective hands, told another story entirely. The hotel dining room was nearly empty when they arrived, too late for the noon crowd and too early for supper. A tired-looking waitress led them to a corner table and took their orders without much interest: steak and potatoes for him, chicken and dumplings for her. "So, Miss Valdez," Garrett said once they were alone, "what brings a woman like you to a place like Redemption Creek?" "Not exactly known for its cultural attractions." Josephine smoothed her napkin across her lap. "I'm opening a dress shop. I've been a seamstress since I was a girl, worked for years in San Antonio, but I wanted my own establishment." The advertisement said Redemption Creek was a growing community with opportunities for enterprising individuals. A corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "That's one way of putting it. Another might be rough mining town desperate enough to pay for a newspaper advertisement." Despite herself, Josephine laughed. "I'm beginning to suspect as much, but I've signed a 6-month lease on a storefront, so I'm committed now." "Brave," he commented, studying her face. "Foolish, maybe, but brave. And what about you, Mr. Mason? What brings you through our humble community?" His expression closed off like shutters drawn against a storm. "Just riding through. Got business further north." "What kind of business, if I may ask?" "The kind that's mine." His tone made it clear the topic was closed. Their food arrived, saving her from having to respond. They ate in silence for several minutes before Josephine tried again. "Have you been a cowboy long, Mr. Mason?" He chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Long enough. Started punching cattle when I was 16. Worked my way up to trail boss for the Double Cross Ranch out of Texas. Did that for 7 years before." He trailed off, then shrugged. "Before I decided it was time for a change. And now I take jobs as they come. Cattle drives when they need experienced hands, some tracking work, whatever pays." "Sounds lonely," she said softly. His eyes flashed to hers, sharp and suddenly alert. "It suits me." The remainder of the meal passed in more comfortable conversation, with Josephine sharing stories of her childhood in San Antonio and Garrett occasionally offering anecdotes about life on the trail. When they finished, he insisted on paying, waving away her protests. "You're trying to start a business," he said simply. "Save your money." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Garrett scanned their surroundings with practiced efficiency. "I'll walk you to wherever you're staying," he said, "just to be safe." "That's very kind. I have a room above Thompson's general store until my shipment of fabrics arrives and I can move into the rooms behind my shop." They walked side by side, close enough that occasionally their arms brushed. Each time, Josephine felt a small flutter in her chest that she told herself was merely lingering anxiety from the earlier confrontation. At the store, Garrett waited while she unlocked the side door that led to the upstairs rooms. "Thank you again," she said, turning to face him. "For everything." He nodded, hat in hand now. "Lock your door, Miss Valdez. Redemption Creek isn't San Antonio." "I will." She hesitated, then asked, "How long will you be in town?" "Leaving at first light," he replied, already stepping back. "Take care of yourself." Josephine watched him walk away, broad shoulders set against the setting sun, until he disappeared around a corner. Only then did she climb the stairs to her rented room, wondering why the thought of his departure left her feeling oddly bereft when they'd just met. Morning brought clear skies and the sounds of a town coming to life. Wagon wheels creaking, shopkeepers raising their shutters, the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards on the edge of town. Josephine dressed carefully in a practical blue cotton dress with a white collar and set out to begin preparations for her shop. The storefront she'd leased was dusty and bare, with uneven floorboards and windows that needed washing. But Josephine could already envision what it would become. Dress forms displaying her latest designs, bolts of fabric arranged by color, a comfortable sitting area where ladies could discuss their requirements over tea. She had just begun sweeping when the door creaked open, admitting a shaft of sunlight and a familiar silhouette. "Mr. Mason," she said, surprised. "I thought you were leaving at first light." Garrett stepped inside, hat in hand. "Changed my plans, figured I might stay a day or two." "Oh." She leaned on her broom, trying to keep her tone casual. "May I ask why?" He looked around the dusty shop, evading her gaze. "Heard there might be work at the Montgomery Ranch outside town. Thought I'd ride out there later, see what's what." Josephine nodded, not entirely convinced. "Well, I'm glad you stopped by. I could use a strong pair of hands if you're not in a hurry." "What needs doing?" She gestured to the heavy wooden counter pushed against the back wall. "I'd like that moved to the front, near the windows where there's better light." Garrett removed his coat, revealing the worn holster at his hip and the powerful lines of his shoulders beneath his shirt. He studied the counter for a moment, then approached it with the careful assessment of a man used to physical labor. "Need to empty it first," he said, pulling open one of the drawers. They worked together for the next hour, Josephine emptying drawers and shelves while Garrett repaired a broken leg on the counter. When everything was ready, he positioned himself at one end. "On three," he instructed, and together they lifted the massive piece of furniture and carried it across the shop. As they set it down near the window, Garrett's hand accidentally brushed against hers. The touch was fleeting, but Josephine felt warmth spread up her arm. When she glanced up, she found him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said, stepping back perhaps a little too quickly. "That's much better." He cleared his throat. "Anything else need moving?" By noon, they had rearranged the entire shop to Josephine's satisfaction. Garrett had worked steadily, his movements efficient and careful. Despite his claims about just passing through, he seemed genuinely interested in helping her establish her business, asking practical questions about where she planned to store extra inventory, and suggesting a better placement for the small stove to maximize heat during winter months. "I don't know how to thank you," Josephine said as they stood surveying their work. "You've saved me days of struggling on my own." Garrett shrugged, but she noticed the pleased look in his eyes. "It's nothing. It's not nothing to me." She hesitated, then added, "I was planning to get some lunch at the cafe down the street. Would you join me?" Something shifted in his expression, a momentary softening before the familiar reserve returned. "I should head out to that ranch I mentioned, see about that job." "Of course." She tried to hide her disappointment. "Well, if you're still in town tomorrow, don't go making plans that include me, Miss Valdez." His voice was gruff, almost defensive. "Like I said before, this ain't about, I'm just passing through, helping out where I can." "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she did. There had been moments throughout the morning when she'd caught him watching her, his eyes warm with what seemed like genuine interest before he'd looked away. He retrieved his hat and coat, nodding once before heading for the door. With his hand on the knob, he paused. "Your shop," he said without turning around. "What are you going to call it?" "Josephine's Fine Fashions and Alterations," she replied. He nodded again. "Good name, simple. People will remember it." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Josephine stood in the middle of her newly arranged shop, wondering at the complexity of the man who had just left, and the strange pull she felt toward him, despite his clear signals that he wasn't interested in anything beyond basic courtesy. She returned to her work, determined to focus on establishing her business rather than dwelling on a cowboy who'd made it clear he was just passing through. But throughout the afternoon, as she washed windows and arranged her sewing supplies, her thoughts kept returning to Garrett Mason and the contradiction between his words and the gentleness of his hands. The Montgomery Ranch was larger than Garrett had expected, sprawling across several thousand acres of grazing land with a well-maintained main house and a collection of outbuildings. As he approached on horseback, he noted the quality of the cattle in the nearest pasture, healthy Herefords with good coloring and size. Frank Montgomery, the ranch owner, was a barrel-chested man with a gray-streaked beard and shrewd eyes. He listened to Garrett's inquiry about work without interruption, then nodded slowly. "As it happens, I do need an experienced hand," he said. "Lost 2 men last month, one to marriage and one to California gold fever. You know cattle, you said?" "Yes, sir." "Was trail boss for the Double Cross out of Texas for 7 years. Montgomery's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Double Cross has a good reputation. Why'd you leave?" The familiar tightness gripped Garrett's chest. "Personal reasons." The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded again. "Fair enough. I don't need your life story, just your skill with cattle. Job pays $30 a month plus room and board. You'll bunk with the other hands, take your meals in the cookhouse. Work starts at dawn, ends when the day's work is done." "Sounds fair," Garrett agreed. "One more thing," Montgomery added. "No trouble. I run a respectable operation here. Any fighting, stealing, or coming back drunk and you're gone without references. Clear, crystal." They shook hands, and Montgomery directed him to the foreman, a weathered Mexican-American named Miguel Sandoval, who showed him to the bunkhouse, a long, low building with a dozen beds, half of them occupied by personal items. "You can take that one in the corner," Miguel said, pointing. "We're branding calves tomorrow, so be ready to ride out at first light." Garrett nodded, dropping his saddlebags onto the indicated bed. The bunkhouse was clean and sturdy, better than many he'd stayed in over the years. The men seemed decent enough when they returned from their day's work, greeting him with the cautious curiosity typical of cowboys meeting a new hand. By supper time, he'd learned most of their names and established himself as someone who knew his business without being boastful about it. The cook served a hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and beef stew, and the conversation flowed easily around tales of cattle, horses, and the occasional reminiscence about places they'd worked before. But throughout the evening, Garrett found his thoughts drifting back to Redemption Creek, specifically to a pair of determined brown eyes and a smile that had made something long dormant stir within him. He told himself it was merely concern for a woman alone in a rough town, nothing more. Certainly nothing worth examining too closely. As he stretched out on his bunk that night, staring at the wooden ceiling, Garrett tried to focus on the job ahead. This was what he knew: cattle, open country, the straightforward exchange of work for pay. No complications, no attachments, no risk of the kind of loss that had driven him from Texas 2 years ago. Yet when he finally drifted off to sleep, it was Josephine's face that followed him into his dreams. Morning came early at the Montgomery Ranch, with the cook banging a metal spoon against a pot to rouse the sleeping cowboys. Garrett was already awake, having developed the habit of rising before dawn during his years as a trail boss. He dressed quickly and joined the others for a breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee. The day passed in a blur of activity, rounding up calves for branding, holding them steady as the hot iron seared the Montgomery mark into their hides, vaccinating and tagging each animal before releasing it back to its anxious mother. It was hard, familiar work, and Garrett fell into the rhythm of it with the ease of a man returning to his native language after a brief sojourn in foreign lands. Miguel worked alongside them, and by midday, he was nodding approvingly at Garrett's skill. "You've done this before," he commented as they paused to drink from their canteens. "Many times," Garrett replied. "You handle yourself well. Montgomery could use more men like you." It was high praise from the taciturn foreman, and Garrett accepted it with a nod of thanks. The work continued until dusk, when they drove the last of the cattle back to their grazing grounds and returned to the ranch, dusty and tired but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. After supper, several of the men organized a poker game, but Garrett declined the invitation to join. Instead, he cleaned his tack and oiled his saddle before turning in early. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and he needed to be fresh. But as he lay in his bunk, listening to the muted sounds of the poker game and the occasional snore from one of the other hands, he found himself thinking again of Redemption Creek, of Josephine Valdez and the shop he'd helped her arrange. Was she safe? Had those troublemakers returned? The questions circled in his mind like buzzards, refusing to be shooed away by rational argument. It was foolish to be concerned. She was a grown woman who had clearly managed on her own before he'd come along. Besides, he had a job now, a good one with fair pay and decent conditions. There was no reason to return to town except for supplies, and even then, not for several weeks. Yet 3 days later, Garrett found himself approaching Miguel after the day's work was done. "Need to ride into town tomorrow," he said. "Pick up a few things." Miguel eyed him thoughtfully. "We're moving the herd to the north pasture tomorrow. I know. I'll be back by midday if I leave at dawn." After a moment's consideration, Miguel nodded. "Be back by noon. We'll need every hand." "Appreciated," Garrett said, already planning what he would say when he arrived in town. Just checking to see that everything was all right with the shop. Nothing more than that. Certainly not because he couldn't get those brown eyes out of his mind. Dawn found him already an hour into his ride to Redemption Creek, pushing his horse at a steady pace that would get him there and back within the time he'd promised. The morning air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of sage and dust and the promise of another hot day. As he approached the town, Garrett told himself again that this was just a brief stop to ease his mind. He'd check on Josephine, perhaps help with any heavy lifting she needed done, and then return to the ranch where he belonged, where things were simple and clear-cut. He tied his horse outside her shop and paused, suddenly uncertain. What if she thought he was intruding? What if she wasn't even there? Before he could reconsider, the door swung open and Josephine stepped out, a broom in hand. She stopped short when she saw him, surprise evident in her face before it was replaced by a smile that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the dusty ride. "Mr. Mason," she said, "this is unexpected." Garrett removed his hat, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. "Miss Valdez was in town for supplies, thought I'd stop by, see how the shop is coming along." Her smile widened and he knew she saw through his flimsy excuse. "How thoughtful. Please come in. I've made considerable progress since you were last here." The shop had indeed transformed in the days since he'd helped arrange the furniture. Colorful fabrics now lined the shelves. A dress form displayed a half-finished gown of deep blue silk, and the counter held neatly organized spools of thread in every shade imaginable. "Impressive," he said, genuinely amazed at how much she'd accomplished in so little time. "Thank you." She gestured toward a small sitting area near the front window. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to have a cup myself." "That would be welcome if it's no trouble." "None at all." He watched as she moved to the back of the shop where a small stove held a pot of coffee. Her movements were graceful and efficient, her dark hair neatly pinned up to reveal the slender curve of her neck. Garrett looked away, focusing instead on the pattern book open on a nearby table. "How is your new job?" she asked, returning with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "The Montgomery Ranch, wasn't it? It's good work," he replied, accepting the cup with a nod of thanks. "Fair pay, decent men. I'm glad." She settled into a chair across from him. "And yet here you are in town, barely a week after starting." There was a teasing note in her voice that made him both uncomfortable and strangely pleased. "Like I said, needed supplies, of course." She sipped her coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup with eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "And have you obtained these necessary supplies yet?" "No," he admitted. "Came here first." "I see." The simple acknowledgement hung between them, laden with unspoken questions. Garrett cleared his throat. "Shop looks good. You've done a lot with it." "I've been working from dawn until well past dark," she said. "My fabrics arrived the day after you left, and I've been setting up ever since. I'll be ready for customers by the end of the week, I hope. Any more trouble?" "From those men, I mean." She shook her head. "No, thankfully, though I did purchase a shotgun from Mr. Thompson at the general store, just in case." The image of Josephine wielding a shotgun brought an unexpected smile to his face. "Good. A woman on her own should know how to protect herself." "My thoughts exactly." She studied him for a moment. "You know, Mr. Mason, Garrett," he interrupted, "if we're going to be friends, you might as well use my given name." Her eyes widened slightly, and he realized what he'd said. Friends. As if he planned to be around long enough for such a thing to develop. "Garrett, then," she said softly. "And you must call me Josephine." He nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "I should be getting those supplies. Need to be back at the ranch by noon." "Of course." Was that disappointment in her voice? "I wouldn't want to make you late." Garrett stood, placing his empty cup on the small table between them. "Thank you for the coffee." "You're welcome anytime," she said, rising as well. "Perhaps next time you're in town you might stay for supper." "I'm a fair cook, or so I've been told." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities that Garrett wasn't ready to acknowledge. "I don't know when I'll be back in town," he said carefully. "Ranch work doesn't leave much free time." "I understand." Her smile remained, though it had dimmed slightly. "The offer stands whenever you find yourself in Redemption Creek again." He nodded, reaching for his hat. "I should go." At the door he paused, feeling that there was something more he should say but unable to find the words. In the end, he simply tipped his hat and stepped outside into the brightening day. As he mounted his horse after hastily purchasing the supplies he'd claimed to need, Garrett told himself that this would be the end of it. He had checked on her, found her well and thriving, and now he could return to the ranch with a clear conscience. There was no reason to come back to town anytime soon. Yet even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. The pull he felt toward Josephine Valdez was unlike anything he'd experienced before, and fighting it was beginning to feel like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm for Josephine. Each morning, she opened her shop at 8 o'clock, worked on commissions and alterations throughout the day, and closed at 6, unless a customer needed evening accommodations. Business was slow at first, but as word spread about the quality of her work, more women from Redemption Creek and the surrounding ranches began to seek her services. Mrs. Montgomery, the ranch owner's wife, became one of her most enthusiastic patrons, commissioning 3 new dresses and bringing her friends to do the same. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and impeccable taste. "Your work is exquisite, my dear," she told Josephine one afternoon as she was being fitted for a deep green visiting dress. "Where did you learn such skill?" "My mother taught me the basics when I was a girl," Josephine replied, carefully pinning the hem. Then I apprenticed with Madame Fournier in San Antonio for 5 years before working in her shop for another 3. Well, Redemption Creek is fortunate to have you. Aren't we, ladies? The 2 women accompanying her murmured agreement, examining the fabrics on display with appreciative eyes. Tell me, Mrs. Montgomery continued, have you met many people in town yet? It must be difficult establishing oneself in a new community. I've met a few, Josephine said, thinking of Garrett despite herself. Everyone has been very welcoming. You must come to dinner at the ranch, Mrs. Montgomery declared. Frank and I entertain regularly, and it would be a perfect opportunity for you to meet more potential customers. That's very kind of you, Josephine said, genuinely touched by the invitation. I would be delighted. Excellent. This Saturday, then, 7 o'clock, as Mrs. Montgomery and her friends left the shop. Josephine found herself both excited and nervous about the invitation. The Montgomery Ranch was the largest in the area, and their social gatherings were sure to be attended by the most influential people in the region. It was a valuable opportunity for her business, and if she wondered whether a certain ranch hand might be present at the main house during such an event, well, that was merely idle curiosity. The intervening days passed in a flurry of activity as Josephine completed Mrs. Montgomery's dress and prepared for the dinner. She had brought several fine gowns from San Antonio, anticipating the need to make a good impression on potential clients, and she selected a rose-colored silk with delicate lace trim that complemented her olive complexion and dark hair. Saturday evening arrived clear and mild. Mr. Thompson from the general store, who had taken a grandfatherly interest in Josephine's welfare, offered to drive her out to the ranch in his wagon. "Can't have you walking all that way in your fine clothes," he said gruffly when she thanked him. "Besides, roads aren't safe for a woman alone after dark." The Montgomery ranch house was ablaze with lights as they approached, lanterns illuminating the wide porch and warm light spilling from every window. A young stable hand came to take the horse and wagon, and Josephine was escorted inside by a maid who took her shawl and directed her to the parlor where guests were gathering before dinner. Mrs. Montgomery greeted her warmly, introducing her to the dozen or so guests already present. They were mostly ranchers and merchants from the area, along with the town's doctor and his wife and the banker and his daughter. Josephine smiled and made conversation, trying to remember names and connections as glasses of sherry were distributed. She was speaking with the banker's daughter about the latest fashion plates from Paris when the parlor door opened again. Josephine glanced up automatically, then felt her heart skip as Garrett Mason stepped into the room. He was almost unrecognizable at first glance. Gone were the trail-worn clothes and dusty boots. Instead, he wore a well-cut black suit with a crisp white shirt and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But his eyes were the same storm gray and alert, scanning the room before settling on her with unmistakable recognition. "Ah, Mason," Mr. Montgomery said, moving to clap him on the shoulder. "Glad you could join us." "Thank you for the invitation, sir," Garrett replied, his voice carrying across the room to where Josephine stood frozen in surprise. "Nonsense. After the way you handled that situation with the rustlers last week, you've more than earned your place at our table." Montgomery turned to the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, for those who haven't met him yet, this is Garrett Mason, my new ranch foreman." Foreman. Josephine's surprise deepened. When had that happened? As if sensing her question, Mrs. Montgomery leaned close to explain. "Miguel's rheumatism has been troubling him terribly this past month. When those rustlers tried to make off with a dozen of our prime cattle last week, it was Mr. Mason who organized the other hands and tracked them down. Frank promoted him on the spot." How fortunate for your husband to have found someone so capable, Josephine managed to say, though her eyes remained on Garrett as he moved through the room, greeting other guests with a reserved courtesy. When he finally made his way to where she stood, Josephine had regained her composure enough to offer a genuine smile. "Congratulations on your promotion, Mr. Mason, or should I say Foreman Mason." A hint of color touched his cheekbones. "Garrett is still fine," he said quietly. "You look very nice, Miss Valdez." "Josephine," she reminded him, "and thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Mrs. Montgomery announced that dinner was served. To Josephine's surprise, she found herself seated next to Garrett at the long dining table, an arrangement that seemed too coincidental to be chance. "Did you know I would be here tonight?" she asked softly as soup was served. Garrett kept his eyes on his plate. "Mrs. Montgomery mentioned she'd invited the new dressmaker in town. Didn't take much to figure out who that might be. And you came anyway." She couldn't resist the gentle tease. His eyes flicked to hers briefly. "It's not polite to refuse your employer's invitation." "Of course." "How thoughtless of me to suggest otherwise." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Perhaps a little," she admitted. "It's not every day I see a cowboy in a suit." "Ranch foreman," he corrected. And this time there was definitely a smile, however slight. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses, each more delicious than the last. Conversation flowed around the table, touching on everything from cattle prices to politics to the latest news from the East. Josephine participated when appropriate, but she was acutely aware of Garrett beside her, the warmth of his arm when it occasionally brushed against hers, the deep rumble of his voice when he answered a question directed his way, the lingering scent of soap and something uniquely him. After dinner, the party moved back to the parlor for coffee and cordials. The banker's daughter took a seat at the piano and began to play, encouraging others to sing along to popular songs. Josephine found herself standing near the window, slightly apart from the group, when Garrett appeared at her side. "Would you like to step out onto the porch?" he asked quietly. "It's getting rather warm in here." She nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape the increasingly boisterous singing. Garrett offered his arm with a formality that seemed at odds with the man she'd first met on a dusty street, and she placed her hand lightly upon it, allowing him to guide her through the French doors onto the wide veranda. The night air was indeed cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the distant hills and the sweet fragrance of Mrs. Montgomery's rose garden. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, more numerous than Josephine had ever seen in San Antonio. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing upward. "Yes," Garrett agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found him looking not at the stars but at her. Heat rose to her cheeks and she turned back to the night sky. "You never came back to town," she said after a moment. "I thought perhaps you'd moved on after all." He sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "Been busy. The promotion means more responsibility, less free time. Of course, I understand. Do you?" He turned to face her fully now. "Because I'm not sure I do." Josephine's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've spent the past month telling myself I don't have time to ride into town, that there's no reason to. That whatever I thought I felt when I walked into your shop that morning was just, I don't know, temporary insanity." "And what did you think you felt?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, mussing its careful arrangement. "I don't know, something I haven't felt in a long time, something I wasn't looking for." "Is that why you stayed away? Because you weren't looking for it?" "Partly." He looked away, his profile stark against the night sky. "And partly because I'm not. I don't have anything to offer a woman like you, Josephine. I'm just a cowboy ranch foreman, she corrected with a small smile. He acknowledged the correction with a tilt of his head. Even so. You're educated, refined. You could have opened your shop anywhere. Why choose a place like Redemption Creek? The question caught her off guard. Because land was affordable here. Because I wanted to build something of my own, away from my father's influence. Your father disapproved of your ambitions. He disapproved of my independence, she clarified. After my mother died, he expected me to remain at home, caring for him and my younger brothers until such time as I married someone of his choosing. When I refused, he made it clear I was no longer welcome under his roof. Garrett's expression darkened. That's harsh treatment for a daughter. He's a harsh man, Josephine said simply. But his rejection gave me the freedom to pursue my own path. For that, at least, I'm grateful. They fell silent, listening to the muted sounds of the party inside and the distant chorus of crickets. Finally, Garrett spoke again, his voice low and hesitant. When I saw you tonight across that room, it felt like being kicked in the chest by a mean-tempered mule. A startled laugh escaped her. Is that a compliment, Mr. Mason? It's the truth, he said, so earnestly that her amusement faded into something warmer and more tremulous. You were the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and for a minute there I couldn't remember why I'd been staying away. And now, she whispered, do you remember? He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the conflicting emotions in his eyes. Now I'm thinking maybe my reasons weren't as good as I thought they were. Josephine's heart thundered in her chest as Garrett's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, to touch her cheek. His calloused fingertips were gentle against her skin, tracing a path from her temple to her jaw with exquisite care. Garrett, she breathed, leaning into his touch almost unconsciously. The parlor door opened suddenly, spilling light and laughter onto the porch. Garrett stepped back immediately, dropping his hand as Mrs. Montgomery appeared in the doorway. "Oh, there you are," she exclaimed. "We were wondering where you disappeared to." Frank is about to propose a toast to the new schoolhouse fund. "Of course," Josephine said, gathering her composure. "We were just getting some air. It's such a lovely night." Mrs. Montgomery's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she merely held the door wider. "Well, do come in. The night air can be treacherous, 1 minute balmy, the next positively chilling." As they followed her inside, Garrett's hand brushed against Josephine's, his fingers briefly curling around hers in a touch so fleeting she might have imagined it if not for the warmth that lingered on her skin. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur for Josephine. She smiled at appropriate moments, contributed to the schoolhouse fund, and accepted Mrs. Montgomery's invitation to return for tea the following week. But her awareness remained fixed on Garrett, who had retreated into his earlier reserve, speaking only when directly addressed and maintaining a careful distance from her. When it came time to leave, Mr. Thompson again offered her a ride back to town. As they prepared to depart, Garrett approached, hat in hand. "Miss Valdez," he said formally, conscious of the others around them. "It was a pleasure to see you again this evening." "Likewise, Mr. Mason," she replied, matching his tone while searching his face for some sign of the man who had touched her cheek with such tenderness on the porch. "Perhaps." He hesitated, then continued with careful neutrality, "Perhaps I might call on you when next I'm in town. To check on how the shop is progressing." Hope bloomed in her chest. "I would like that very much." He nodded once, then stepped back to allow Mr. Thompson to help her into the wagon. As they drove away, Josephine glanced back to see Garrett still standing where they had left him, watching until they disappeared into the darkness. The journey back to town was quiet, with Mr. Thompson respecting her pensive mood. Only when they reached the shop did he speak, his voice gruff with concern. "That cowboy," he said. "Mason. He paying you proper attention?" Josephine smiled at the protective note in the old man's voice. "Mr. Mason has been nothing but a gentleman, I assure you." Thompson harumphed. "Saw how he was looking at you. Man's got intentions, whether he admits it or not." "Perhaps," she said noncommittally. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate your kindness." Inside her small apartment behind the shop, Josephine moved to the window, gazing out at the starlit street. The evening had awakened possibilities she'd hardly dared to contemplate before, possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. Garrett Mason was a man with secrets. She was certain of it. Something in his past had taught him to guard himself, to keep others at a distance. Yet tonight, for a brief moment on that moonlit porch, she had glimpsed behind that careful reserve to the man beneath, a man capable of tenderness, and perhaps, just perhaps, of love. The question was whether he would allow himself to act on those feelings, or if whatever demons haunted him would drive him away again. Josephine sighed, turning from the window. Only time would tell. For now, she had a business to run and a life to build, regardless of what one complicated cowboy might or might not decide. The days following the Montgomery dinner passed without any sign of Garrett. Josephine told herself she wasn't disappointed, that she understood his duties at the ranch kept him busy. Still, she found herself glancing up eagerly whenever the shop door opened, hoping to see his tall figure silhouetted against the sunlight. On Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Montgomery arrived for her promised tea, bringing with her 2 daughters-in-law who had recently returned from visiting relatives in Denver. They spent a pleasant hour discussing the latest fashions from the East and placing orders for new fall wardrobes. As they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Montgomery lingered, waiting until her daughters-in-law were examining fabrics at the far end of the shop before speaking in a lowered voice. "I hope you don't think me forward, my dear, but I couldn't help noticing a certain interest between you and Mr. Mason at our dinner party." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mrs. Montgomery, the older woman, patted her hand reassuringly. "Please, don't be embarrassed. I think it's wonderful. Garrett is an excellent man, hardworking, honest, and clearly quite taken with you, though he tries to hide it." "I'm not sure that's the case," Josephine said carefully. "We've only met a few times." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Mrs. Montgomery said with a knowing smile. "Frank and I were engaged after just 2 meetings, when you know, even if there were feelings," Josephine began. "Mr. Mason seems reluctant to act on them." Mrs. Montgomery's expression softened with understanding. "He's had a difficult time of it, from what Frank has been able to learn. Lost his wife and child to fever some years back in Texas. The kind of loss that changes a man." The revelation struck Josephine like a physical blow, a wife and child. Gone. Suddenly, Garrett's reserve, his reluctance to form attachments, made terrible sense. "I didn't know," she said softly. "Few do. He doesn't speak of it." Mrs. Montgomery squeezed her hand. "I only tell you this because I see something special developing between you two, and I would hate to see it falter due to misunderstandings." Before Josephine could respond, the daughters-in-law rejoined them, and the conversation necessarily turned to lighter topics. But as she bid them farewell and returned to her sewing, Josephine's thoughts remained with Garrett and the tragedy he had endured. That evening, as she was preparing to close the shop, the door opened to admit a ranch hand she recognized from the Montgomery dinner. "Miss Valdez?" he asked, removing his hat. "I've got a message for you from Foreman Mason. Said to tell you he's riding into town tomorrow afternoon and would be obliged if you'd receive him." Josephine's heart quickened. "Yes, of course. Please tell Mr. Mason I'll be expecting him." The young man nodded, replaced his hat, and departed as quickly as he had come. Josephine stood for a moment in the center of her shop, caught between anticipation and uncertainty. Now that she knew about Garrett's past, how should she approach him? Should she mention what Mrs. Montgomery had told her, or wait for him to share his history in his own time? Sleep proved elusive that night as she turned these questions over in her mind. By morning, she had resolved to follow Garrett's lead. If he chose to speak of his loss, she would listen with compassion. If not, she would respect his privacy while offering the same openness and honesty she would expect in return. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Josephine found herself making careless mistakes in her sewing, distracted by the anticipation of Garrett's visit. When a customer mentioned the time, nearly 4 o'clock, she realized with a start that he might arrive at any moment. She had just finished tidying the shop and checking her appearance in the small mirror behind the counter when the door opened. Garrett stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking both determined and apprehensive. "Miss Valdez," he said formally. "Mr. Mason." She smiled, hoping to ease some of the tension evident in his stance. "Please come in." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment he simply stood there, seeming at a loss for words despite having requested this meeting. "Would you care for some tea?" Josephine offered. "Or coffee? I was just about to have some myself." "Coffee would be welcome," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Thank you." As she busied herself with preparing the coffee, Josephine could feel his eyes following her movements. The silence between them was charged with unspoken words, with the memory of that brief touch on the Montgomerys' porch, and all that had remained unsaid afterward. When she returned with 2 cups, Garrett had removed his coat and taken a seat in the small sitting area. He accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, then set it aside untouched. "I owe you an explanation," he said abruptly, "for my behavior at the Montgomerys and before that." Josephine settled into the chair opposite him. "You don't owe me anything, Garrett. I do." His eyes met hers directly for the first time since entering the shop. "You deserve to know why I've been inconsistent." She nodded, giving him space to continue at his own pace. Garrett drew a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "7 years ago, I was married to a woman named Ellen. We had a son, Thomas. He was 5 when—" He paused, swallowing hard. "When the fever came through our settlement, took half the town, including my family. I was away on a cattle drive. By the time I got back, they were already buried." The pain in his voice was so raw that Josephine had to resist the urge to go to him, to offer comfort he might not be ready to accept. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without meeting her eyes. "After that, I threw myself into work, became trail boss, spent most of my time on the trail. Easier that way, no attachments, no risk." "And then you came to Redemption Creek," Josephine prompted gently when he fell silent. "And then I met you." His gaze lifted to hers, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "And suddenly, all those walls I'd built didn't seem so solid anymore." Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Is that a bad thing?" "It's terrifying," he admitted. "The thought of caring again, of maybe losing again. I told myself it was better to keep my distance, that this wasn't about." He gestured vaguely between them. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you. Couldn't stop finding excuses to ride into town, even when I told myself I wouldn't." "And now?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Garrett stood suddenly, moving to the window to stare out at the street. His back was to her, shoulders tense beneath his shirt. "Now I'm here, trying to explain why I've been acting like a fool, hoping you might understand, hoping it's not too late." Josephine rose and crossed to him, gently placing her hand on his arm. It's not too late, Garrett. He turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his eyes nearly undid her. I can't promise anything, he said hoarsely. I don't know if I can be what you deserve. I'm not asking for promises, she replied. Just honesty and perhaps a chance to see where this might lead. For a long moment, he simply looked at her as if searching for something in her face. Then slowly, tentatively, his hand came up to cup her cheek, much as it had on the Montgomery's porch. But this time there was no interruption, no reason to pull away. Josephine, he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips. And then he was kissing her, gently at first, then with growing urgency as she responded in kind. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against the solid warmth of his chest. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the strength there, the slight tremor that betrayed how deeply this moment affected him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. This wasn't what I planned to say when I came here today, he confessed. A small laugh escaped her. What did you plan to say? Some nonsense about checking on your shop, making sure those troublemakers hadn't returned. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. But when I saw you, all those carefully prepared words just vanished. I'm glad they did, she said, smiling up at him. I much prefer honesty to polite fictions. Garrett's answering smile transformed his face, easing the lines of worry and making him look younger, lighter. In that case, honestly, I'd like to call on you properly, if you're amenable. I am very amenable, she assured him. They spent the remainder of the afternoon really talking about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Garrett spoke more of Ellen and Thomas, sharing memories with a bittersweet smile that suggested the sharp edges of his grief had begun to soften with time. Josephine told him about her strained relationship with her father and her determination to succeed on her own terms. As the light began to fade outside the shop windows, Garrett reluctantly announced that he needed to return to the ranch. Miguel is covering for me, but I shouldn't take advantage of his generosity, he explained as he donned his coat. Of course, Josephine said, walking with him to the door. When will I see you again? Sunday is my day off, he replied. I thought perhaps we might attend church together, then have dinner afterward, if that suits you. It suits me very well. At the door he hesitated, then bent to press a gentle kiss to her lips. Until Sunday, then. Josephine watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and rode away, raising his hand in farewell, before disappearing around a corner. Only then did she close the door and lean against it, pressing her fingers to lips that still tingled from his kiss. Whatever uncertainties the future might hold, one thing was clear. Garrett Mason might claim this wasn't about love, but his hands, those strong, gentle hands that had touched her with such tenderness, told another story entirely. Over the weeks that followed, Garrett became a regular visitor to Redemption Creek. Each Sunday, he would arrive in town in time for the morning church service, immaculately dressed in his best clothes, hat in hand as he escorted Josephine to a pew near the back of the small church. Afterward, they would dine either at the hotel restaurant or, when the weather permitted, enjoy a picnic by the creek that gave the town its name. Josephine's business continued to flourish, with orders coming in not just from Redemption Creek but from neighboring communities as well. She had to hire a young woman named Clara as an assistant to keep up with the demand, teaching her the basics of sewing while handling the more complex work herself. Garrett, too, was thriving in his position as foreman at the Montgomery ranch. Mr. Montgomery spoke highly of his work, telling anyone who would listen that cattle losses were down and productivity up since Garrett had taken charge of the day-to-day operations. Their courtship progressed with a measured pace that respected both Garrett's lingering caution and the proprieties expected by the community. They were seen together at social gatherings, church functions, and occasionally riding together on the outskirts of town, always within the bounds of what was considered appropriate for an unmarried couple. But it was during the private moments when they sat talking in the back room of Josephine's shop long after closing time, or when they walked hand in hand under the stars after a community dance that the true depth of their connection revealed itself. On one such evening in late October, nearly 3 months after Garrett's confession in the shop, they sat before the small fireplace in Josephine's apartment, discussing plans for the upcoming winter. "The ranch will be quieter once the snow comes," Garrett was saying. "Cattle hunker down, need less active management. Might be able to spend more time in town then." "I'd like that," Josephine replied, watching the firelight play across his features. Over the past months, the lines of tension that had marked his face when they first met had softened. He smiled more easily now, laughed more frequently. "Though I worry about you riding in bad weather. Been riding in worse conditions than a little snow since I was a boy," he assured her. "Besides, I have good reason to make the journey." The warmth in his eyes as he looked at her made her heart skip. Josephine had come to recognize that look it appeared whenever Garrett thought she wasn't watching, a mixture of wonder and tenderness that belied his early insistence that this ain't about love. "Josephine," he said after a moment's silence, his tone suddenly serious, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She set aside her sewing, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Garrett shifted in his chair, uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been thinking. The ranch hands' quarters are no place for a foreman, not permanently. Montgomery mentioned there's a small cabin on the north edge of the property. Used to belong to the previous foreman before he retired. Said I could have it if I wanted to fix it up." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Josephine said, puzzled by his apparent anxiety. "It needs work," he continued. "New roof, some repairs to the porch, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, decent-sized kitchen, room for a garden maybe." Understanding began to dawn. "It sounds lovely." Garrett took a deep breath, then moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I'd like to fix up that cabin, but not just for me." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet determined. "I'd like it to be our home, Josephine. If you do me the honor of becoming my wife." Though she had begun to suspect where the conversation was heading, the actual proposal still took her breath away. "Garrett," she whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. For a moment, uncertainty flashed across his face. "I know it's not much to offer. And I know your business is here in town. We could figure something out. Maybe you could keep the shop, ride in when weather permits. Or if you'd rather wait until I can afford something better, closer to town." "Yes," she interrupted, squeezing his hands. "Yes, Garrett, I don't need anything fancy. Just you." Relief and joy transformed his expression. "You're sure it won't be an easy life?" "I'm sure," she said, reaching up to cup his face. "I love you, Garrett Mason. I have for months now." It was the first time either of them had spoken those words aloud, though they had been evident in 100 small gestures. In the way he always made sure she had firewood stacked by her door before a cold snap. In how she packed extra biscuits in his lunch when he had to ride back to the ranch after dark. In the gentle touches and lingering glances that said what neither had been quite ready to voice. "I love you too," he said hoarsely. "More than I thought possible. Kept telling myself this wasn't about love, that I was just being friendly, looking out for a woman on her own. But my heart knew better all along." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "It's not fancy," he warned as he opened it and tipped a ring into his palm. "Had it made from a gold nugget I panned years ago in California." The ring was simple but beautifully crafted, a smooth band of gold with a small pearl nestled in the center. It's perfect, Josephine breathed as he slid it onto her finger. Garrett rose, drawing her up with him and into his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. "Before winter sets in," she suggested. "Give us time to prepare the cabin before the worst weather arrives." He nodded, his smile warming her more thoroughly than the fire. 4 weeks. Give us time to publish the banns, make the necessary arrangements. 4 weeks, she agreed. Though we'll need to tell Mrs. Montgomery as soon as possible. I suspect she'll want to host the wedding breakfast. Garrett laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained in a way she had rarely heard from him. "She's been dropping hints about making an honest woman of you for weeks now. I think she's been planning the wedding breakfast since the night of that dinner party." As predicted, Mrs. Montgomery was delighted by the news, insisting on hosting not only the wedding breakfast but the ceremony itself on the ranch's sprawling grounds. "The garden will still have some late roses," she declared, "and we can set up a tent in case of inclement weather. It will be perfect." The preparations consumed the following weeks. Josephine worked on her wedding dress in the evenings after the shop closed, a creation of ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice and cuffs. Garrett, true to his word, began repairs on the cabin, enlisting several of the ranch hands to help with the more substantial work. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Most reactions were positive congratulations from customers, knowing smiles from those who had watched their courtship unfold, offers of help with wedding preparations. But there were also whispers, particularly among some of the town's more conservative matrons, about the speed of the engagement and Josephine's decision to continue running her shop even after marriage. "Don't pay them any mind," Clara advised when she noticed Josephine's distress after overhearing a particularly pointed comment. "They're just jealous because Mr. Mason is the finest catch this town has seen in years and you got him." Josephine laughed, her spirits lifting. "Thank you, Clara. And thank you for agreeing to manage the shop during my absence. It eases my mind considerably knowing it's in good hands." The plan they had worked out was practical. Josephine would close the shop for 2 weeks after the wedding, then reopen with Clara managing day-to-day operations while Josephine handled the more complex work from home, riding into town 3 days a week when weather permitted. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but Garrett had been supportive from the start. "Your shop is part of who you are," he'd said when they discussed it. "I wouldn't ask you to give that up any more than you'd ask me to stop working with horses." The day before the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with just enough chill in the air to hint at the winter to come. Josephine spent the morning at the shop, finishing last-minute details and instructing Clara on what needed to be done during her absence. In the afternoon, she traveled out to the Montgomery ranch with Mrs. Thompson, who had appointed herself unofficial chaperone for the occasion. The ranch was a flurry of activity, with servants and ranch hands alike helping to prepare for the following day's celebration. Mrs. Montgomery greeted Josephine warmly, showing her to the guest room where she would spend the night. "Your young man is over at the cabin," she informed Josephine with a knowing smile. "Putting the finishing touches on your home, he says, though I suspect he's simply too nervous to be idle." "Might I see him?" Josephine asked. "Just briefly. There's something I'd like to give him before tomorrow." Mrs. Montgomery hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have one of the boys drive you over, but mind you're back in time for dinner and no spending the night there." Bad luck to see the bride on the wedding day before the ceremony. The cabin was a short ride from the main house, situated on a gentle rise overlooking a small stream. As the ranch hand who had driven her departed with a promise to return in half an hour, Josephine took a moment to admire what would soon be her home. The cabin was indeed small, but sturdy and welcoming, with a newly repaired porch and fresh paint on the shutters. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the windows she could see the warm glow of lamps. She knocked lightly, smiling when she heard Garrett's startled coming from inside. When he opened the door, his surprise gave way to pleasure, then concern. "Everything all right?" he asked, ushering her inside. "Everything's perfect," she assured him, taking in the interior of the cabin. The main room was simply furnished with a sturdy table, chairs, and a comfortable-looking sofa before the fireplace. Through an open door, she glimpsed the kitchen with its iron stove and wooden counters. "It's lovely, Garrett. You've done so much." "Still more to do," he said, though he couldn't hide his satisfaction at her approval. "But it'll be comfortable enough to start." Josephine removed a small package from her reticule. "I brought you something. An early wedding gift." Garrett accepted it with a curious expression, carefully unwrapping the paper to reveal a silver pocket watch. When he opened it, he found an inscription inside the cover. "To Garrett, all my love for all our time together, Josephine." "It's beautiful," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "I noticed you were still using that old brass one that loses time," she explained. "I thought you might like something more reliable." He closed the watch gently, tucking it into his pocket before drawing her into his arms. "One more day," he murmured against her hair. "One more day," she agreed, savoring the solid warmth of him. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted with a soft laugh. "Not about marrying you, that's the one thing I'm completely certain of, but the ceremony, all those people watching." "Just look at me," she advised. "Pretend it's just the two of us." He kissed her then, a tender promise of all the days to come. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers in what had become a familiar gesture of intimacy. "I should get back," Josephine said reluctantly. "Mrs. Montgomery will send out a search party if I'm gone too long." Garrett nodded, though he made no move to release her. "Tomorrow," he said, the word both a promise and a prayer. "Tomorrow," she echoed, stretching up to kiss him once more before stepping back. "And then forever." The wedding day arrived with unexpected warmth for November, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was held in the Montgomerys' garden as planned, with late roses and autumn foliage creating a perfect backdrop for the occasion. Josephine wore her ivory silk gown with a crown of small white flowers in her dark hair. Garrett, standing at the makeshift altar with the minister, looked more handsome than she had ever seen him in a new black suit ordered specially from Denver. As she walked toward him on Mr. Thompson's arm, the old shopkeeper having agreed to stand in for her absent father, Josephine saw nothing but Garrett's face, the wonder in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for hers when she arrived at his side. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. They had chosen traditional vows, the familiar words taking on new meaning as they pledged themselves to one another before God and their community. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett's kiss was gentle, but filled with such promise that Josephine felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. The celebration afterward was everything Mrs. Montgomery had promised. Abundant food, music provided by local musicians, dancing and laughter that continued well into the evening. Through it all, Garrett remained at Josephine's side, his hand often seeking hers as if to reassure himself that this was real, that she was truly his wife. As twilight descended, they slipped away from the festivities to the cabin that would be their home. Garrett insisted on carrying her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the main room where a fire burned merrily in the fireplace, casting a golden glow over the simple furnishings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mason," he said softly. Josephine looked up at him, this man who had entered her life so unexpectedly and become so essential to her happiness. "I love you, Garrett." His smile was tender as he traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "And I love you. More than I have words to say." But as the night deepened, he found other ways to express that love in the reverent touch of his hands as they undressed each other, in the whispered endearments against her skin, in the way he held her afterward as if she were the most precious thing in his world. In those quiet moments, with moonlight filtering through the curtains and Garrett's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that despite his early protests, this had always been about love. His hands had told the truth long before his words caught up. 5 years later, Josephine sat on the porch of their cabin, watching as Garrett taught their 4-year-old son, James, to ride a gentle pony in the yard. Their daughter, Ellen, named for Garrett's first wife in a gesture that had healed something deep within him, played nearby, her dark curls catching the late afternoon sunlight as she arranged pebbles in careful patterns. The years had brought changes both expected and surprising. Josephine's dress shop had grown into a thriving business, now managed primarily by Clara, while Josephine focused on designing and creating special commissions from home. Garrett had continued as foreman at the Montgomery Ranch, his skill with cattle and horses earning him a reputation throughout the territory. They had built a good life together, not always easy, but rich in love and mutual respect. As she watched her husband lift James from the pony with strong, gentle hands, praising the boy's progress, Josephine recalled that day so long ago when a gunshot had sent her ducking behind a water trough, and a stranger had stepped into the street to defend her. "This ain't about love," he'd insisted later, even as his every action had told a different story. How far they had come since then, how many fears conquered, how much joy discovered. Garrett looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, so much quicker now, so much more frequent, warmed her as thoroughly as the autumn sun. He said something to James, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch, settling beside her on the swing he had built 2 summers ago. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping his arm around her shoulders. Josephine leaned into him, savoring his solid presence. "I was just thinking about the first time we met, about how determined you were to keep your distance." He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Wasn't very successful at that, was I?" "No," she agreed, smiling up at him. "Your hands gave you away." Garrett looked puzzled. "My hands? MMM." She took one of those hands in hers, tracing the calluses and lines that spoke of years of hard work. "The way you'd guide me around mud puddles without quite touching my elbow. The way you'd make sure I had everything I needed before seeing to yourself. The way you touched my cheek that night on the Montgomery's porch." She pressed a kiss to his palm. "Your mouth might have said one thing, but your hands told another story entirely." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a tenderness that still had the power to take her breath away. "Smart woman," he murmured, bending to kiss her softly. "Knew I was in trouble the moment I saw you." "The best kind of trouble," she reminded him. "The very best," he agreed, gathering her closer as they watched their children play in the golden light of late afternoon. "And I wouldn't change a moment of it." As twilight descended on their little homestead, bringing with it the first cool breath of evening, Josephine Mason counted herself blessed beyond measure. The young woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing but determination and skill had found not just success, but a love worth crossing every frontier, for a love that had begun with a cowboy's reluctant hands, telling truths his heart wasn't yet ready to admit.